Today we are using Gapminder to display and compare the rise of CO2 emissions per given year to the total populations of several countries. CO2 is the measurement of the total carbon dioxide emissions, which comes from the burning of fossil fuels and is measured in the units of 1,000 metric tons. The reason it's important to track CO2 emissions is because it is a greenhouse gas. It absorbs heat in the atmosphere and prevents it from escaping back into space, and thus contributes to global warming. For our first run-through, we are showing all the countries in order to find out which countries are the greatest contributors to global CO2 emissions. The buildup of CO2 emissions starts out in the 1800s at the start of the Industrial Revolution and continues slowly. As you can see, the countries start out close with low emissions and low populations, until the turn of the century, in which three countries stand out from the rest. The first is the United States, as a green dot above the group as lead contributor to the CO2 emissions. And India and China are two large red dots at the right of the group as countries with rapidly growing populations. These countries continue to rapidly distance themselves from the rest of the world, with India and China, who were not as industrialized as the United States before the 1990s, during this time, and slowly in correlation over ever-growing populations and their population's contribution to their country's CO2 emissions. At the end of the run, we can clearly see the countries that contribute to CO2 emissions are the United States, India, and China, with China leading the way at 10.3 million tons in 2014. On the second run-through, I am showing India and China together starting at the early 1900s, as the two countries are, at first, running virtually parallel in their population and carbon dioxide emissions. This parallel will continue until the 1960s, wherein, with the assistance of the Soviet Union, China was able to kickstart industrialization, changing China's from an agrarian economy and adding an industrial one, and by so doing, started China on the path to becoming a major producer of CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions produced by China will continue to grow through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Finally, in 2000, China's CO2 emissions would start an epic climb that would continue to this day. And now, as China, as of 2005, passed the United States as the world's largest producer in CO2 emissions. Once again, we will run through the comparison, but this time focusing on the United States. And this time, the data may suggest a possible solution to the problem. The United States' history with CO2 emissions starts with the Industrial Revolution. The comparison shows how the population of an industrialized nation affects the reduction of CO2 emissions. As you can see, it's a much steeper incline when compared to India and China. This is due to the fact that industrialization touches every person in the United States, from the farmer and his tractor, to the two cars in almost every driveway, to the coal-fired plants that produce electricity that keep our cities running day and night. It has been said many times, the United States is addicted to fossil fuels. But all is not lost. If you examine the data closely, we find something interesting. That in 2008, the United States starts a decline of CO2 emissions that continues to 2012. At first, I must acknowledge the United States had such declines in the past, and it has always returned to its upward climb. These declines can be attributed to several wars and the Great Depression. In 2008, it was something different. The Great Recession began, and gas prices skyrocketed, and as a result, CO2 emissions fell. This proves that with price controls, innovation in energy technology, and conservation techniques, we could turn the CO2 emissions problem around. And if we can do it in the United States, we may be able to convince other countries to do the same and put an end to the threat of global warming.